Another way to think about what we're learning is we're going to be following the birth of the United States from colonies to the Articles of Confederation. And to help some of the things on the next slide make more sense, we're going to start with a map that shows us that the British are far from alone as colonizers in North America, extending their South American empire through North America, clear up into what will be Texas, the American Southwest. We have Spain, we have the French in this area, some British territory up here, but in terms of what is populated, it's this. And there are, if you were to zoom in on the Caribbean, there are colonial powers as diverse as the Netherlands and Denmark. Sweden gets in on it with some colonists. So the point of that is several other countries colonized North America. But even if this were not an American history class or an American government class, we would give the British the bulk of the attention here because they were far and away, the largest group of colonists in North America. Not even close in comparing them, especially to the French. Okay, and for now, our focus will be really on the eastern half of North America, north of what's now the border with Mexico. The British are late to the game. They don't get their first permanent foothold in North America until Jamestown in 1607. Okay, and even that was a near thing. And while I do say British are the most numerous group, and I do mean British here because that would include not just people who were English, but also Scottish, Irish, Scots-Irish, Welsh. Whoever they are, the political traditions and the legal traditions they bring with them are decidedly English. And political traditions like limited government. Which we get some bits of in the Magna Carta in 1215. We get the Petition of Right in 1628, which has to reiterate some of the same kinds of things that we will see in the Magna Carta. And we will, just as fair warning, be spending some time looking at these documents themselves in detail, and also the English Bill of Rights in 1689. From the development of parliamentary government, beginning with Magna Carta in 1215, we see Parliament increase its footprint within the English government, but also its power. There are setbacks, sometimes fits and starts, but in the broad sweep of history, what we see is a stronger and stronger parliamentary government vis-a-vis the monarchy. From the Magna Carta, Petition of Right, and English Bill of Rights, we also get due process. This is one of those places where I would encourage you to come up with an abbreviation system. Does not need to be mine. But I would like you to find some way to spare yourself having to write out all of those documents' names in full every time. And common law. I know this is the second time I've mentioned common law. It doesn't seem on the face of it to many people like it would be that important, but it's hard for me to overstate the importance of common law. even though in a lot of ways we can think of it as unwritten law, there's not just a book of laws that you can go to that will tell you what the precedents are. And all we really have are chains of previous courts' decisions that give us precedents. But those accumulate over centuries to make legal interpretations strong, but increasingly also consistent. It's essential still to the British. It's essential to the federal government and 49 of the 50 states, Louisiana, of course, being our exception, with its legal system more based on the Napoleonic Code. So the colonists bring a lot of stuff with them. But you often will see the colonies referred to in textbooks about this era as schools of government, where the colonists learn to govern themselves. And keep in mind, we don't just have 13 colonies right off the bat. This is a gradual development. Virginia from Jamestown is first in 1607. The last colony, Georgia, is not added to the collection until 1733. Yeah, so different colonies had different lengths of time to kind of build up their own sense of self-government. Something else that affected how colonies served as schools of government was the type of colony they were, which, if you did the homework, you already have a sense of those three types. We're going to start with proprietary colonies. And for each type of colony, we're going to talk about how many there were in 1775. Because we need a common time period for all this. The colonies could change type over time, and they certainly did. By the time we get to 1775, the only proprietary colonies are Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware, with Pennsylvania being the most famous, named for William Penn, and the most famous of the proprietors. And these you can think of as very much like the feudal fiefs you learned about in world history class. It's a grant of land from the king to an individual. But instead of calling that individual, just a duke or something, we refer to them as a proprietor, like the owner of it. Like the proprietor of a business is the owner of a business. In this case, it's who received the grant of land from the king. That person had primary sway over how the government was going to work within their colony. The second type are the charter colonies. And by 1775, there are only two left. And they are tiny Connecticut and even more diminutive Rhode Island. That's all. And that was because the king revoked some of those charters and made them a type of colony that we're going to see next. And Massachusetts had been one of the first charter colonies. It was settled by pilgrims. The pilgrims landed in Massachusetts by accident. They were blown off course. So they ended up landing in a different territory than what their arrangement with the monarchy covered. So, seeing that, at least in their eyes, they needed to form their own arrangement. They agreed to the Mayflower Compact amongst themselves, which makes them famous not because you used to have to make hand turkeys and pilgrim hats in elementary school, but because the Pilgrims represent the first incidents of self-government by British in North America. The charter colonies, more than either of the other types, really had a lot of power and autonomy for self-governance. It wasn't total. The king had to approve any governor that was elected by the eligible voters of the colonies. And remember, eligible voter here is a very restricted group. It is white males who own property. And if the king doesn't like the governor they've elected, they will have to try again. What makes them more of a standout is the power of their legislatures. In our current system, legislatures pass bills that become law if the president signs them, or in some other narrowly defined circumstances. But here, the legislatures themselves passed laws. And those laws were not to be vetoed either by the governor or even the king. As long as that colony retained its charter, its legislature had those powers. Because of that status early on in their history, these colonies didn't necessarily have to, or Connecticut and Rhode Island, the charter colonies, upon becoming independent from Britain, developing their own state governments, they didn't necessarily have to make the same changes to their legislative institutions that other states had to make. They had very well developed legislatures. The third type, and we will see is the most numerous, clearly the most numerous, were the royal or crown colonies. And both names mean the same thing. I more often see the label crown colonies than royal colonies. From north to south, 1775, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, so small states, but also New York, New Jersey, Virginia, which was kind of the most notable big state. The two Carolinas and Georgia were all crown colonies, which meant, as you might have guessed, they were directly under control of the monarch, and who in this time period is a king, always a king. These become more numerous as charters are revoked. Virginia loses theirs in 1624. Massachusetts in 1691. This is a good time for me to tell you, I am not huge on you remembering dates. Some of them will eventually probably stick in your brains anyway, but I am never going to ask you on a test when Massachusetts charter was revoked. We are not firefighters. If we need to know something like that, we have time to look it up. It didn't used to be that way. The civics test you used to have to pass as part of completing your government course included a question that required you to know the day, month, and year that the Constitution went into effect. We don't need to do that to you. There are better things to keep in your brain. In crown colonies, the king appointed the governor and also a council of advisors. And the council of advisors was a strange beast. It was two branches of government, kind of, rolled into one. The council of advisors was part of the state legislature, or the colonial legislature. it was also the highest part of the judicial branch in the colony. Okay, so it has a role in making the laws, but also in interpreting the laws. So not the same separation of powers we see in our federal government today. Any laws that were passed out of that legislature before they could take effect had to receive the approval not only of the governor within the colony, but also the king. Yeah, so these colonies were kept on a much shorter leash. At least in terms of how the institutions are laid out on paper. What we're going to see next is how the colonies acted as schools of government. And that first involves the story of the colonies largely being just left to their own devices. And they're left alone for several reasons. One, for a lot of colonial history, the British Parliament and the monarchy are in death matches over power. The English Civil War. So quite actually a death match between the Parliament and the monarch. And that kind of conflict is not really going to settle down until after 1688 with the Glorious Revolution, when the British, having lost their monarch, import a couple of monarchs, William and Mary, William of Orange, to serve as their new king and queen. And even when the British in Britain are not distracted, we still have a phenomenon that is known as salutary neglect. Another way to say this would be benevolent neglect. You should remember it, though, as salutary neglect for the purposes of this class. But if you can't remember what salutary means, think of benevolent neglect. Benevolent neglect. Meaning being neglected was good. Even if the government in Britain wants to pay attention to the colonies are 3,000 miles away. To reach them requires an ocean voyage that takes weeks in each direction. And so news travels slowly. Colonial requests, British government instructions or orders, all of those things take a lot of time. And that meant that the colonists really could get away with quite a lot and had a lot of autonomy just because they were hard to supervise. Which leads into the next point that I've already thrown up there. Partly because of this neglect, legislatures were able to find ways to manipulate their governors. So we might have a royal governor that on paper is really powerful, has veto power over the laws that a legislature would like to pass. But in reality, the legislatures could manipulate those governors, and they didn't have to resort to really anything that complicated. All they had to do was not vote to approve pay to the governor. They're not saying, Governor, we're taking away your salary. They're saying, Governor, we know that we owe you this money. We're not going to give it to you until you do what we want. And this was a common strategy in the colonies. As a result of distraction, salutary neglect, and manipulation by the colonists, by the time we get to the mid-18th century, the relationship between the British government in Britain and the British colonists was basically a federal system. Bless you, Blake. You had a government in Britain that had its government, its powers over the colonists, but you also had in the colonies their own governments, often with powerful representative elements that could also pass laws and enact policies for their own colonists. Very much like the relationship you see with Washington, D.C. and the state governments right now in the United States. We've talked about legislatures, and for the colonists, there's a reason that Congress is the branch of government described in Article 1 of the Constitution. Okay, the legislative branch was where stuff happened as far as the colonists were concerned. So talking about their legislatures is important. It's also not that difficult. There are two types. One is unicameral, which means one chamber or one house, which is, as we can see on the map, there's a reason I've kept this map from slide to slide to slide. By the time we get to 1775, Pennsylvania is the only colony that has a unicameral legislature. The others are all bicameral, which means two chambers or two houses. And in addition to that being the typical form of legislature, typically that legislature would have an upper and a lower house. And you can think about the upper house as the more prestigious house. In the United States, it's really the only kind of difference. Because at this point, we have direct election of senators, and of course, always had direct election of members of the House of Representatives. But what we can see in the way the British ran things, where you have an appointed upper house, that's often very common. Still, in the United Kingdom today, you have the House of Commons, whose members of Parliament are elected, and then you have the House of Lords, who are called peers, and they are either appointed to be in the House of Lords, or they're there by heredity. It's been passed down in their family for generations. The third way the colonies served as schools of government were in various efforts to unite the colonies, which you should not see as something that was inevitable. There is nothing inevitable about the fact that 13 colonies, upon gaining their independence from Britain, would agree to form a single country. The colonies were very different in terms of what they did, in terms of their policies on slavery. There were a lot of divisions. And the early efforts at unity were failures. The first is the New England Confederation. It was small. It involved only territory that is today's Massachusetts and Connecticut. Massachusetts being there and Connecticut there. So not large. It did last for 50 years, which sounds impressive until we realized that during that time it existed for one purpose, and that was to pool resources to defend those territories against attacks by Native Americans. But as the threat from Native Americans diminished, the purpose of the Confederation diminished, and in 1684 it dissolved. The next two things we're going to see are more bold proposals. 1696, William Penn, the proprietor of Pennsylvania, pitched colonial cooperation on those three areas: defense, but also trade. And trade was an issue not only between the colonies, but also was a source of conflict between the British in Britain and the British colonists. And also, he wanted cooperation on criminal law, because you need to think about these as all separate entities. Their relationship is not defined to each other. It's defined to the government in Britain across the Atlantic Ocean. So you can imagine if somebody commits a crime in Connecticut and skates across the corner of Massachusetts into New York, there's no really set way for law enforcement officials in Connecticut to get New York to send that suspect back to Connecticut to be charged and tried. His proposal met with basically total disinterest, and that was it. It was a dead letter. The last plan we'll talk about is the best known of all of them. It is the 1754 Albany Plan. It's the most ambitious, but probably what makes it the most famous is that it is the brainchild of Benjamin Franklin, who was famous even then and on both sides of the Atlantic. He was inspired by things that were not new: colonial trade problems and attacks, although we now are concerned about attacks by the French. This is on the eve of the French and Indian War that we will not talk about today, but attacks by the French were a concern. And so Ben Franklin proposed a colonial Congress, and Congress here means the same thing that our Congress means. You're going to have representatives, they were called delegates at the time, from all of the colonies, meet in a place to make laws and decide policies. And they were going to have a lot of power in Ben Franklin's idea. And they would have a power to form a colonial military. So we're not talking about militias of the colonies or of towns. We're talking about more of a permanent military establishment for an army and a navy. This Congress was also going to claim for itself what are foreign policy powers. Okay, and colonies don't have those. After World War I, when Ireland gets home rule, and I'm talking about what becomes the Republic of Ireland, not Northern Ireland, but the rest of it. Okay, when they get home rule, they're able to govern themselves at home, but they have no foreign policy power. Britain still dictates what the foreign policy of the Irish will be. Here, the colonists, right, who have not been granted those same home rule policies, are claiming for themselves foreign policy ones. The ability to declare war, to make peace, and form trade treaties with the Native American nations. I mean, this would be like if a group of United States got together and said, you know what, we now also say that we get to declare war. We're going to make our own trade treaties with China, Mexico, and Canada. We'll take it from here. That would not fly. He also wanted it to have the power to levy taxes across the colonies. Taxes are always a contentious issue in the United States. It's not going to be all that many years later that the power to tax is going to be called the power to destroy. And Franklin even proposed that this power to tax extended to customs duties, which does not excite anyone until you know what that means. And then it probably, to be honest, is not going to excite a lot of you anyway. What this means is that the colonial governments would be able to tax goods, including goods that were imported from Britain. In colonial relationships, the colonies are not supposed to impose taxes on, in this case, what would most likely be manufactured goods from the imperial power. But Franklin was proposing that they be able to do that. And for those reasons, it is no surprise at all that the king said no. And also other colonies said no. As I said, the colonies are already, you can see divisions north and south. And the Albany Plan is a northern colony plan. Albany is in upstate New York. The colonists who sent representatives initially for this plan were all from the northern colonies, and so it just didn't work. Okay, we're going to stop there. Next thing up is the French and Indian War.